Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're shackling ourselves to young Finn, a medieval knight's squire, as he endures one utterly thankless, soul-crushingly damp day of servitude in late autumn. Think less chivalric romance, more chronic back pain, and existential despair, all served with a generous helping of mud. Before we wade into the 13th century equivalent of being an unpaid intern, with a much higher chance of dysentery, please do consider subscribing if you, for reasons that continue to mystify and delight me, genuinely enjoy these historical explorations of why our ancestors were probably miserable most of the time. Let me know in the comments what medieval profession you think would be the absolute worst. Bonus points if it involves cleaning something truly unspeakable. Now, find a comfortable spot. A luxury Finn can only dream of between polishing Sir Caelan's armor and dodging Thunderclap's ill-tempered kicks. Perhaps grab a beverage that isn't actively fermenting in a leather skin. And let's begin our trudge through a day better left forgotten. The concept of a good night's sleep for Finn was less a reality and more a distant, almost mythical rumor, whispered by troubadours who clearly never had to share a damp corner of a half-collapsed tent, with 3 other snoring, twitching bodies, and a family of remarkably bold mice. His current bed, if one were to stretch the definition to its absolute breaking point, was a patch of lumpy earth under a threadbare canvas lean-to, reluctantly shared with a burly man-at-arms named Gregor, whose nightly symphony of snores sounded like a bear gargling gravel, and a younger, perpetually coughing archer called Pip, whose hacking fits punctuated the darkness with alarming regularity. The air was thick with the ripe aroma of unwashed humanity, damp wool, old leather, horse, and something vaguely fungal that Finn suspected was breeding in the sodden straw beneath him. Every so often, a delicate scuttling sensation would traverse some part of his anatomy. A mouse, perhaps, or a particularly adventurous insect. Finn had long ago stopped flinching. He just hoped they wiped their feet. Tonight, the persistent drizzle had managed to find at least 3 new entry points in their already compromised shelter, each drip landing with the cold, accusatory persistence of a debt collector. One particularly artistic trickle had chosen the exact spot above Finn's left ear, ensuring that even in the depths of unconsciousness, he was never far from a reminder of nature's subtle sadism. He wasn't so much woken, as he was gradually reassembled from a state of numb oblivion by a series of escalating discomforts. First, the gnawing cold seeped into his bones, a damp, invasive chill that his thin blanket treated more as a suggestion than a barrier. Then, the cacophony. Gregor had evidently reached the crescendo of his nasal opera, a sound so profound it seemed to vibrate the very earth, while Pip had launched into a fresh volley of coughs that sounded suspiciously like he was trying to expel a lung. The final, undeniable signal that the universe demanded his unwilling participation in another day came in the form of a sharp, stabbing pain in his lower back, a familiar greeting from the lumpy ground he called his mattress. He shifted, a symphony of creaks and groans escaping him that seemed far too ancient for his 19 years. For a blissful, fleeting moment, he considered the radical act of simply not moving, of letting the damp and the misery claim him. Perhaps Sir Caelan could find another long-suffering youth to polish his ego and his steel. But then the image of Sir Caelan attempting to buckle his own greaves, a spectacle of flailing limbs and frustrated oaths that Finn had unfortunately witnessed once before, spurred him into reluctant motion. Besides, staying put usually just meant someone else would eventually kick him awake, often with less ceremony and more boot. A wave of dread, as reliable as the sunrise, though considerably less welcome, washed over him. Another day of servitude, another day of mud, another day of trying to anticipate the whims of a man whose moods shifted more frequently than the English weather. He lay there for a moment longer, a human puddle of resignation, contemplating the profound injustice of a world that started this early. The darkness was still absolute, a thick, inky blackness that felt heavy and suffocating. It wasn't the comforting darkness of a warm bed, but the oppressive pre-dawn gloom that hinted at unseen horrors and misplaced bootlaces. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all the squires who had ever suffered before him, Finn began the awkward fumbling process of extricating himself from his nest. His limbs were stiff, his muscles protesting with a series of dull aches that promised to sharpen into full-blown agony as the day wore on. He reached for his tunic, which lay in a damp, pathetic heap beside him. It felt clammy and cold against his skin, smelling faintly of mildew and regret. Pulling it on was an exercise in shivery contortion, a silent battle waged in the dark against unyielding, damp fabric. His brays, medieval trousers for the uninitiated, and no more comfortable than they sound, were in a similar state of damp dejection. Dressing in the dark was a skill born of necessity, a clumsy ballet of touch and memory. He fumbled for his boots, encountering Gregor's remarkably solid leg instead, earning a grunt that could curdle milk. "Apologies, Gregor," he muttered to the darkness, not that Gregor would hear or care. Finally, his fingers closed around the cold, stiff leather of his own footwear. They were, of course, also damp. Putting them on was like forcing his feet into two chilled, unyielding coffins. Once vaguely upright and questionably dressed, Finn began the more perilous task of locating Sir Caelan's essentials, all by feel. The knight, bless his entitled heart, would expect his riding gloves, his belt, his dagger, all laid out, despite the fact that laying anything out in this damp mausoleum was an invitation for it to be either stolen by rodents or absorbed by the mud. Finn's hands, rough and calloused, became his eyes, patting and probing through the small, chaotic pile of Sir Caelan's overnight accoutrements. Was this the belt, or a particularly stiff piece of dried eel Gregor had been gnawing on? Ah, the telltale coldness of the buckle. Found. Next, the dagger. His fingers brushed against something soft and furry. He paused. The soft, furry thing wriggled. Finn withdrew his hand with commendable speed, deciding the dagger could wait until there was at least a rumor of light. Some things, even a battle-hardened squire, or at least a squire hardened by proximity to battles, didn't need to investigate too closely before dawn. His stomach rumbled, a hollow, pathetic sound. Breakfast, he knew, would be a distant dream, likely consisting of whatever stale bread hadn't yet succumbed to the green fuzz and a sip of water that tasted suspiciously of the river they'd crossed 2 days prior, the same river the supply wagon had capsized in. The thought did little to lift his spirits. The rasping cough from Pip's corner intensified, followed by a wet, hacking sound that made Finn wince. He made a mental note to try and acquire some of the wild thyme the camp herbalist occasionally found. Not for Pip's sake particularly, but because the sound was putting him off the idea of eventually eating. Every morning began like this, a slow, agonizing crawl out of oblivion, a fumbling preparation in the cold and dark, and the immediate crushing weight of the day's responsibilities. He could already feel the familiar ache in his shoulders from the mere thought of Sir Caelan's chainmail, the dull throb in his knees that always accompanied a day of walking through muck, and the general sense of weariness that was his constant companion. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the sheer grinding monotony of it, the endless cycle of service and discomfort, all for a cause he increasingly found to be as flimsy and unconvincing as the canvas above his head. A familiar, agonizing throb in his lower back announced the day with all the subtlety of a tax collector. It was, he reflected with a grim internal smile, the squire's alarm clock, reliable and unwelcome. The only small positive, if one could even call it that, was that the rain seemed to have momentarily paused its assault on their tent. A brief ceasefire, no doubt, before the main offensive began with the dawn. He shuffled towards the tent flap, or what remained of it, bracing himself for the cold, damp, and thoroughly uninspiring reality that awaited him outside. Another day, another deluge of indignities. Joy. The first hint of dawn was less a majestic unveiling of light and more a reluctant smear of gray, reluctantly seeping into the inky blackness. It was the kind of light that didn't so much illuminate as reveal the full extent of the previous night's damp degradation. For Finn, this meager illumination signaled the official commencement of his labors, a daily sentence he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy, though Sir Kalen came remarkably close some days. His first task, as always, was to attend to Thunderclap, Sir Kalen's warhorse, a beast whose temperament suggested it was perpetually on the verge of a violent existential crisis. The horse, a hulking brute with eyes that promised retribution for crimes unknown, was picketed nearby, and its current mood could usually be gauged by the vehemence with which it kicked at its tether. Today, the stake was practically dislodged, promising. Finn approached with the cautious deference one might reserve for a sleeping dragon. Every muscle in his body, still stiff and protesting from the cold, damp earth, screamed in silent rebellion. His back, already a tapestry of dull aches, sent a particularly sharp signal of disapproval as he bent to retrieve a grooming kit that looked as weary as he felt. The cold air, thick with the smell of wet earth and smoldering, reluctant fires, bit at his exposed skin. His fingers, already numb, fumbled with the stiff leather straps of the horse's blanket. Thunderclap, sensing an opportunity for early morning entertainment, promptly swung its massive head around and attempted to bite Finn's shoulder. Finn, through years of practice, sidestepped with a sigh that was mostly air, partly resignation. "Morning to you too, you magnificent terror," he muttered, too low for the horse to hear, though he suspected it understood the sentiment perfectly and was merely choosing to ignore it. Currying the beast was an exercise in patience and peripheral vision. Thunderclap had an uncanny ability to aim a kick precisely where Finn had been standing a second prior. The mud, thick and treacherous underfoot, made every movement a gamble. One slip, and he'd be tasting the grime, much to the horse's presumed delight. His arms ached as he worked the brush over the animal's muddy coat, trying to achieve a semblance of cleanliness that would last approximately 10 minutes, or until Thunderclap found a fresh patch of mud to roll in, whichever came first. Each stroke was a small victory against the encroaching filth, a tiny, almost pathetic act of defiance in a world seemingly determined to be as grubby as possible. His breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a visible testament to the energy being expended just to stay warm, let alone work. The unique miseries of a squire's early morning were legion, and Finn was intimately acquainted with all of them. The freezing temperatures turned metal objects, like bits, buckles, and sword hilts, into instruments of minor torture, leaching heat from his fingers with malicious efficiency. Visibility in the gray, misty dawn was abysmal, transforming familiar objects into shadowy threats. More than once, Finn had tripped over a sleeping dog, a misplaced saddle, or even memorably, a slumbering baronet who had chosen a particularly inconvenient spot to pass out. The local wildlife, too, seemed to take particular umbrage at early risers. Squirrels chattered aggressively from the sodden branches overhead, occasionally dropping debris with alarming accuracy, and he swore he saw a badger giving him a look of profound disapproval from the edge of the woods. It probably resented the competition in terms of general surliness. Then came the first crisis of the day, as inevitable as Sir Kalen's eventual demand for hot water, a substance Finn had yet to see materialize in this godforsaken camp. As Finn was attempting to saddle Thunderclap, a process akin to wrestling a very large, very angry eel, he noticed one of the main girth straps was frayed, hanging on by a few pathetic threads. It must have happened during yesterday's march. Or perhaps Thunderclap had developed a taste for leather in the night. The universe, Finn reflected, clearly had a quota for pre-breakfast disasters, and he was always first in line to meet it. A broken girth strap meant an unrideable warhorse. An unrideable warhorse meant a very unhappy Sir Kalen. A very unhappy Sir Kalen meant a day of creative torment for Finn. He stared at the offending strap with the kind of despair usually reserved for fatal diagnoses. There was no spare. Of course there was no spare. Spares were for well-organized, competently led expeditions, not this shambling circus of despair. He'd have to attempt a field repair, using skills he didn't really possess, with tools that were probably rusting in the bottom of a forgotten chest. All this, while Thunderclap tried to nudge him into the mud, and the camp slowly, painfully coughed itself awake around him. He fumbled for his utility knife and a length of cord he kept for just such emergencies. Emergencies being a broad term that covered everything from repairing his own disintegrating shoes to, apparently, amateur saddlery. His fingers, clumsy with cold, struggled with the knots. Thunderclap, sensing his frustration, let out a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. "Oh, laugh it up, you oversized goat," Finn grumbled, yanking the cord tight. The repair was ugly, a Frankensteinian patchwork of old leather and new cord, but it looked like it just might hold. For how long was anyone's guess? But it would at least get them past Sir Kalen's initial inspection. The knight, thankfully, rarely looked too closely at anything that wasn't reflective. The nature of early interactions within the camp was a masterclass in terse, functional communication, often delivered with a delightful undercurrent of simmering resentment. Orders were conveyed through grunts, sharp gestures, or the occasional barked command from a sergeant whose voice sounded like it had been aged in a barrel of rusty nails. A curt guttural yelp from the direction of Sir Kalen's tent, which Finn interpreted as, "Squire, where is my blasted insert missing item of apparel here?" Swinged that the knight was stirring. Complaints, and there were many, manifested as low, indistinct grumbling, a collective sigh of resentment that could power a small windmill. If only anyone had the energy to build one. The pecking order was reinforced not through discussion, but through the subtle allocation of the worst tasks, the strategic ignoring of a lesser man's attempts at conversation, or simply the way a higher-ranking man-at-arms would casually commandeer the driest spot by the fire, leaving the lower orders to contemplate the joys of hypothermia. Finn, being a squire, was fairly low on this ladder, existing somewhere between a valued servant and a piece of sentient luggage. His body, already a museum of minor ailments, was staging its daily rebellion. The chill from his damp bedding had settled deep in his joints, making every movement a stiff, crackling affair. Yesterday's particularly enthusiastic session of weapons practice with Sir Kalen, which mostly involved Finn getting repeatedly whacked while the knight pontificated about form, had left a constellation of bruises that now throbbed with renewed vigor. A new pain, a sharp twinge in his left knee, announced itself as he heaved Sir Kalen's heavy wooden practice dummy out of the way. A fresh injury to add to his collection. Exhaustion, despite the day having barely begun, was already a heavy cloak on his shoulders. He felt as though he hadn't slept in a week, possibly a month. The human body, he mused, was a remarkably resilient thing, capable of enduring astounding levels of abuse. It was also, he noted as a fresh wave of dizziness washed over him while cinching Thunderclap's hopefully repaired girth, remarkably good at reminding you of that abuse at the most inconvenient times. He paused, leaning against the horse for a moment, waiting for the world to stop swimming. Thunderclap, in a rare moment that could almost be mistaken for sympathy, but was probably just surprise at the unexpected leaning post, remained still. It was a small mercy, a tiny island of non-aggression in a sea of early morning misery. He took a deep breath, the cold air a painful shock to his lungs. The day was young, and already he felt 100 years old. The prospect of hours more of this, stretching out before him like a barren, muddy wasteland, was almost too much to bear. Almost. As the gray smudge of dawn grudgingly gave way to a slightly less gray, but equally morose morning, the tempo of torment for Finn didn't lessen. It merely changed its rhythm. The initial frantic rush of preparing Sir Kalen and his accoutrements transitioned into the sustained, grinding labor of the march. If the pre-dawn was a sharp stab of discomfort, the late morning was a slow, crushing weight. pressing down with the kind of relentless persistence that could make a stone weep. Sir Calin, now mounted atop the begrudgingly repaired thunderclap, was a figure of relative comfort, occasionally barking an order or a complaint that the wind, with a wisdom Finn deeply envied, often snatched away. Finn, however, was on foot, his boots already several pounds heavier, thanks to the clinging, sucking mud that seemed to view his progress as a personal affront. The physical demands, which had started the day at an unreasonable level, now escalated with a kind of perverse creativity. The path, if one could call the sodden, rutted track a path, grew steeper. Every incline was a personal insult to his aching calves and burning thighs. Sir Calin's spare helmet, which Finn was tasked with carrying because it apparently interfered with the knight's optimal field of vision, which mostly consisted of the back of the man in front of him, seemed to gain weight with every passing mile. Did someone sneak rocks into it? Or was it merely absorbing the ambient misery of the march, becoming denser, heavier, a small steel burden of pure suffering? Then there was the shield, strapped to his back, its unforgiving edges digging into his shoulder blades, a constant nagging reminder of its presence. He trudged, one foot squelching out of the mud, the other sinking in, a human winch in a losing battle against gravity and terrain. The cumulative effect of hours of this was a profound, bone-deep weariness, a state where every movement was an act of sheer willpower, and the idea of simply lying down in the mud and letting nature take its course held a dangerous allure. The environment, far from offering any respite, seemed to conspire against them with renewed enthusiasm. The earlier drizzle, which had briefly paused as if to catch its breath, now returned with a vengeance, not as a cleansing rain, but as a cold, persistent seep that found its way down his neck, under his collar, and into every seam of his already damp clothing. The wind, too, decided to join the fun, whipping around corners with a biting chill, carrying with it the scent of more rain and the faint, discouraging aroma of mildew from his own tunic. It seemed personally offended by their direction of travel, constantly gusting into their faces, making even forward motion a struggle. The world was reduced to shades of gray and brown, a monotonous, depressing landscape that offered no beauty, no solace, only more mud and more misery. The trees, skeletal and dripping, looked as though they too had given up. Occasionally, the narrow track would force them close to the swollen, churning river, its gray waters a churning testament to nature's current ill humor, and Finn couldn't help but imagine the sheer, blissful oblivion of just letting himself tumble in. He quickly dismissed the thought. Knowing his luck, he'd probably only get colder and wetter. Exhaustion, as it always does, began to breed carelessness. The brain, starved of proper rest and fueled by inadequate rations, starts to make decisions that a well-slept mind would find appalling. Finn's mistake, when it came, was both mundane and infuriating. They were navigating a particularly treacherous, slick section of the track, a narrow ledge of slightly less soggy mud between a thorny thicket and a drop into a gully filled with what looked suspiciously like ancient pig slurry. Sir Calin, in a rare fit of wanting to appear competent, was issuing a series of largely unhelpful instructions about where to place one's feet. Finn, distracted by trying to prevent Sir Calin's spare lance from snagging in an overhanging branch while simultaneously calculating the odds of Thunderclap deciding this was the perfect moment to shy, misheard. Or perhaps his brain, in an act of self-preservation, simply refused to process another order. The knight had gestured vaguely to the left, a command Finn's weary mind interpreted as, "Move left to allow the pack mule carrying the cooking pots to pass." What Sir Calin actually meant, as became abundantly clear a second later, was, "Look left at that suspiciously rustling bush that might contain bandits, you witless oaf." Consequently, Finn, in attempting to be helpful to the, entirely imaginary in this specific context, mule, took a shuffling step to his right. His right foot, seeking purchase on the slick mud, found none. Instead, it encountered a particularly greasy patch of clay that offered all the support of wet soap. there was a moment of horrifying weightlessness, a brief, flailing ballet of windmilling arms and a startled yelp. His own, he was dismayed to realize. And then he was going down. He didn't just fall. He executed a perfect, if unintentional, comedic slide, landing with a resounding squelch, bottom first, into the thickest, most noxious-smelling part of the gully. The pig slurry, or whatever vile concoction it was, wasn't deep enough to be a drowning hazard. But it was more than sufficient to ensure he was coated from the waist down in a thick, glutinous, indescribably foul ooze. Sir Kalen's spare helmet, dislodged by the fall, rolled a little further into the muck with a dull plop. The immediate aftermath was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by the gentle patter of rain, and what Finn could have sworn was a snicker from Thunderclap. Sir Kalen stared down at him, his face a mask of utter disbelief, rapidly contorting into fury. "Finian," he roared, his voice cracking with indignation. "Are you attempting to compost yourself, of all the idiotic, clumsy, oafish things to do?" Finn just sat there for a moment, immersed in the cold, stinking embrace of the gully, a profound sense of resignation washing over him. The smell alone was an assault. The physical action of the mistake was now secondary to its tangible olfactory consequences. He was, quite literally, in it up to his elbows. Or at least his buttocks. The rustling bush, incidentally, turned out to contain nothing more threatening than a very startled rabbit, which now looked at Finn with an expression of what could only be described as pity. Climbing out was an undignified struggle, each movement producing a fresh chorus of sucking, squelching sounds. He emerged, dripping, reeking, and with a new, intimate understanding of porcine waste management. The other men-at-arms who witnessed the spectacle were, to their credit, mostly successful in stifling their laughter, though a few telltale tremors of amusement ran through the ranks. The sergeant, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from weathered oak and then beaten repeatedly with a mallet, merely shook his head, a silent commentary on the general state of squirely incompetence. Sir Kalen's subsequent tirade about vigilance, attentiveness, and the almost supernatural ability of squires to find new and inventive ways to vex their masters was long and eloquent, though Finn, still trying to discreetly scrape the worst of the mire from his chausses, caught only about half of it. The gist, however, was clear. Finn was an idiot, and he now smelled like one too. The knight, whose demands for a faster pace were legendary even when conditions were perfect, now insisted, with a voice dripping with sarcasm, that perhaps Finn might appreciate a brief pause to freshen up, knowing full well there was no water clean enough for miles to achieve such a miracle. The external pressure to keep moving, despite his now spectacularly soiled state, was immense. Each challenging stare from a passing soldier felt like a judgment on his very existence. Just when Finn thought the morning couldn't possibly get any worse, the universe, in its infinite capacity for cruelty, dangled a false promise. For a glorious 10 minutes, the rain actually stopped. A watery sun even made a brief, heroic attempt to pierce the oppressive cloud cover. A collective sigh of something that might have been relief rippled through the column. Perhaps, just perhaps, the worst was over. Finn allowed himself a sliver of hope, a tiny, fragile thing. Maybe his clothes would even begin to dry. Maybe the mud would solidify. Maybe Sir Kalen would be struck by a sudden, uncharacteristic bout of amnesia regarding the gully incident. Naturally, it was not to be. The sun, evidently exhausted by its effort, retreated behind the clouds as if it had seen enough. The wind picked up again, colder this time. And then, the rain began anew, not the previous drizzle, but a determined, heavy downpour, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away any lingering optimism. The track, already a quagmire, transformed into a shallow, fast-flowing stream of mud. Finn, his brief hope cruelly extinguished, felt something inside him quietly give up. The only positive, if one could torture the word to mean such a thing, was that the fresh rain was at least washing away some of the more aromatic evidence of his earlier misadventure. It was, however, replacing it with a thorough, bone-chilling soak that promised a spectacular case of ague by nightfall. The grind had indeed intensified, reaching a new, almost artistic level of sustained wretchedness. If the morning had been a relentless assault, midday was the enemy's triumphant occupation of Finn's personal landscape of misery. The brief, watery appearance of the sun had been a cruel jest. Now, the sky had settled into a determined slate-gray oppression, not actively raining with the earlier ferocity, but weeping a steady, fine mist that was somehow more insidious. It wasn't enough to wash away the filth, but it was perfectly calibrated to ensure that every garment clung with the intimate, clammy embrace of a second, much less comfortable skin. The temperature hadn't risen. Instead, a damp, penetrating cold had set in, the kind that bypassed flesh and settled directly into the bones, making them ache with a dull, resonant throb. Metal, like the rings of Sir Caelan's mail coif that Finn had to adjust because the knight complained it was pinching his noble ear, was now icy to the touch, each contact a fresh jolt of unpleasantness. Visibility remained stubbornly poor, the world a smear of gray and mud-brown, offering no visual relief, just endless, monotonous dreariness. The only mercy was that the mist kept most of the biting insects at bay. Even they, it seemed, had standards, and preferred not to venture out in this particular brand of atmospheric wretchedness. The narrator might sardonically note that nature, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that being wet, cold, and coated in pig-adjacent slurry was quite enough suffering for one man, and had graciously spared him the additional torment of gnats. For now. The worst task of the day, by an unspoken but universally acknowledged consensus amongst the lower orders, was always reserved for when spirits were at their lowest and physical resilience was most compromised, just after the march paused for its pitiful midday break. Today's special horror, bestowed upon Finn with a grunt and a dismissive wave from the company's cook, a one-eyed man named Cuthbert whose culinary philosophy seemed to revolve around the principle that if it didn't kill you, it was probably edible, was to dispose of the previous night's leavings. In a concession to what passed for sanitation in this mobile disaster zone, a shallow pit had been dug some distance from the main camp. However, some distance was a relative term, and the journey involved navigating a particularly boggy patch of ground while carrying 2 overflowing wooden buckets whose contents threatened to slosh with every unsteady step. The buckets themselves were an affront to several senses simultaneously. The aroma was a complex bouquet of regret, poorly digested rations, and the kind of primal stench that makes one question the very concept of communal living. Finn, his face a mask of stoic revulsion, a look he was perfecting daily, hefted the sloshing containers. Each step was a gamble. The ground squelched ominously, threatening to suck his boots clean off his feet, or worse, to trip him and grant him an even more intimate acquaintance with the bucket's cargo than his earlier gully adventure. He focused on a distant, particularly miserable-looking tree, making it his unwilling focal point, a grim beacon in a sea of potential olfactory disaster. The contents of the buckets seemed to possess a malevolent life of their own, shifting and gurgling with each movement, a constant gurgling reminder of the indignity of his current occupation. Reaching the pit, a muddy depression that looked more like a failed attempt at a well than a place of sanitary disposal, was an anticlimax. The act of emptying the buckets was performed with eyes squeezed shut and breath held, a swift, desperate maneuver to minimize contact and exposure. He didn't linger. The retreat was performed with considerably more haste, though the phantom stench he knew would linger in his nostrils for hours, a subtle perfume of despair. The narrator might observe that while some men were destined to make history, others, like Finn, were clearly destined to carry its less glamorous byproducts. His body, which had been staging a quiet rebellion all morning, now escalated to open insurrection. As he trudged back from the latrine pit, a vicious cramp seized his right calf, twisting the muscle into a knot of pure agony. He stumbled, biting back a cry, and had to stop, leaning heavily against a thankfully sturdy and relatively clean tree, kneading the rebellious muscle with mud-caked fingers. His grip, usually reliable from years of hauling, polishing, and general drudgery, felt weak and uncertain. Earlier, while attempting to adjust a strap on Sir Kalen's saddlebag, his fingers had simply refused to cooperate, fumbling uselessly as if they belonged to someone else. His vision, too, was playing tricks. The constant gray gloom, combined with exhaustion and hunger, made spots dance before his eyes. Tiny, dark flickers at the edge of his sight that he desperately hoped weren't the harbingers of some new, exciting malady. The world felt slightly tilted, unreal, as if he were viewing it through a layer of dirty water. Collapse felt like a distinct, almost inviting possibility. He imagined the blissful oblivion of just stopping, of letting the mud claim him. It was a recurring fantasy, one that grew more appealing with each passing hour. People died on campaign like this all the time, not in glorious battle but from a mundane infection, a stupid accident, or simply by being worn down until their bodies just gave up. Finn could see how easily it could happen, a quiet fading away in the muck, an undignified exit from a life that was, in itself, largely undignified. And then there was the meal. If one could, in good conscience, apply such a noble term to the pathetic offering that constituted their midday sustenance. Rest was not on the menu. The halt was brief, just long enough to refuel before the afternoon's fresh batch of misery commenced. Finn received his portion. A chunk of bread so hard it could have been used to sharpen tools, and probably had been. A sliver of dubious grayish meat that might have been salted pork, or possibly a cleverly disguised piece of old shoe leather, and a ladleful of water from a barrel that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Norman conquest. The water was brownish, with unidentifiable flecks swimming lazily within it. Bonus protein, perhaps. He ate standing up, leaning against a wagon wheel, wolfing down the meager fare with the grim determination of a man stoking a very inefficient furnace. The bread scraped his throat. The meat, if it was meat, was stringy and tasteless, and the water tasted of rust, wood, and despair. It wasn't food. It was fuel, and poor quality fuel at that, barely enough to keep the engine of his suffering sputtering along. He saw Sir Kalen a short distance away, actually seated on a folding stool, another item Finn had to carry, partaking of some slightly better fare from his private stash, some dried fruit perhaps, or even a piece of cheese. The knight did not offer to share. This surprised Finn not at all. Luxury, like dry socks and a painless existence, was clearly for other people. The midday incident, when it occurred, was a symphony of mundane disaster. It wasn't a dramatic bandit attack or a heroic last stand. It was something far more humiliating and, in its own way, far more representative of their daily grind. A rickety supply cart, laden with what few remaining sacks of oats they possessed for the horses, was attempting to navigate a particularly treacherous section of churned-up mud near the riverbank. The carter, a man named Tom, whose face was a road map of weariness, urged his two skeletal mules forward. The mules, clearly sharing Finn's general assessment of the day, dug in their heels, their ears flattened in stubborn refusal. Tom cursed, a string of colorful oaths that would have impressed a docker. He cracked his whip, not with any real force, but with a kind of weary desperation. One of the cart's wheels, already wobbly and complaining, finally decided it had had enough of this peripatetic nonsense. With a sound like a giant cracking his knuckles, followed by a sharp, splintering crack, the axle gave way. The cart lurched violently, tipped precariously, and then, with a groan of tortured wood, it collapsed onto its side, spilling half its precious cargo of oats into the thick, oozing mud of the riverbank. The reaction was immediate and chaotic, though remarkably devoid of shouting save for Tom's initial howl of pure anguish. There was a collective groan from the nearby men-at-arms, the sound of hope, for their horses at least, visibly deflating. Several men rushed forward, not so much to help, as to stare at the disaster with a kind of morbid fascination. The mules, suddenly free of their burden, merely looked confused, then began to tentatively nibble at the more accessible of the spilled oats, as if this had been their plan all along. Sir Calin, observing from a slight distance, threw his hands up in a gesture of utter exasperation, his face turning a rather fetching shade of purple. He didn't bellow orders. He seemed too stunned by this fresh new layer of incompetence to articulate his rage. Instead, he just pointed a shaking finger at the mess, then at his sergeant, then back at the mess. A silent pantomime of fury. The sergeant, a man whose expression rarely changed from one of stoic grimness, waded into the scene, his voice a low rumble as he began to organize a salvage operation. Men were dispatched to try and scoop up what oats they could, a truly miserable task that involved sinking knee-deep into the glutinous mud. Other men began the equally unenviable job of trying to right the cart and assess the damage to the axle, which looked to Finn's untrained eye comprehensively and irrevocably shattered. The sounds were of squelching mud, strained grunts as men heaved at the broken cart, the quiet cursing of those attempting to retrieve the soiled grain, and the occasional mournful bray from one of the mules, who seemed to be commenting on the sheer futility of it all. There was no grand drama, no heroic intervention, just another miserable setback, another delay, another drain on their already dwindling resources, played out under a weeping gray sky. Finn watched it all, a cold knot forming in his already protesting stomach. Fewer oats meant weaker horses. Weaker horses meant slower progress, or more burdens for the men. And more burdens for the men, usually translated, through some arcane process of delegation, into more burdens for Finn. Midday, the peak of suffering, had delivered its masterpiece. The transition from midday's acute crisis to the afternoon's chronic despair was seamless, a mere shifting of gears in the great lumbering machine of their suffering. The drama of the collapsed oat cart eventually subsided, replaced by the grim, slogging reality of making up for lost time with even fewer resources and considerably lower morale. If Finn thought the morning had been a trial by mud and misery, the afternoon introduced him to a new circle of hell, the one reserved for mind-numbing monotony, performed by a body already screaming for respite, and a mind that was rapidly losing its tenuous grip on coherence. The tasks of the afternoon became a blur, a repetitive cycle of squelch, trudge, adjust, and endure. Sir Calin, perhaps sensing the general air of mutiny that simmered just beneath the surface of the company's exhaustion, had become marginally less vocal, though his displeasure still radiated outwards like a noxious miasma. Finn walked, sometimes beside Thunderclap, who, having had a small muddy snack of oats, was now merely irritable rather than actively homicidal. Sometimes trailing behind a wagon, his eyes fixed on the ruts ahead, his brain blessedly, terrifyingly blank. He adjusted straps that had already been adjusted a dozen times. He shifted the weight of the shield on his back, trying to find a new patch of skin for it to chafe. He listened to the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels, the slosh of mud underfoot, the distant weary cough of Pip, and the occasional mournful sigh that escaped his own lips unbidden. Each step was a near identical repetition of the last, a percussive symphony of misery played out by his aching feet. Carpal tunnel syndrome hadn't been invented yet, but Finn was fairly certain his wrists were making a compelling case for its early discovery through the repetitive motion of just existing as a squire. The world narrowed to the immediate, the physical, the cold dampness, the hunger pangs, the ever-present ache in his lower back that was now less a distinct pain and more a fundamental state of being. Mental degradation was an insidious creep, At first, it was just a profound inability to concentrate. Orders, when they were given, seemed to swim in his ears, taking precious seconds to penetrate the fog of his exhaustion. Then his mind began to wander, drifting to increasingly bizarre and irrelevant thoughts. He found himself contemplating, with intense seriousness, whether mud had feelings, and if so, whether it enjoyed being trod upon quite so relentlessly. He replayed, in vivid detail, a time 3 years ago when he'd eaten an entire, slightly bruised apple, savoring the memory of its crispness, its sweetness. A stark contrast to the gritty, tasteless fare that was his current reality. He started seeing faces in the patterns of the bark on trees, grimacing visages that seemed to mock his progress. Were those trees actually whispering? Or was it just the wind? Or perhaps the first sign that his sanity was packing its bags and preparing to abandon ship? He caught himself nearly addressing a particularly gnarled root as Uncle Bernard before a fresh wave of rain shocked him back to some semblance of awareness. These were the psychological cracks appearing, the mind's desperate attempts to escape a reality that had become almost unbearable, all observed by a narrator who might note that while Finn's grip on reality was loosening, his grip on Sir Caelan's spare helmet remained regrettably firm. The afternoon crisis, when it arrived, was less dramatic than the midday oat catastrophe, but more personally irritating for Finn. It began with a subtle, yet ominous change in Thunderclap's gait. The horse, which had been plodding along with its usual air of equine disgust, began to favor its left foreleg. Just a slight hesitation at first, then a more pronounced limp. Finn, his senses now morbidly attuned to any new potential source of woe, spotted it immediately. Sir Caelan, cocooned in his own discomforts and lofty thoughts, remained oblivious for a good 10 minutes, until Finn finally plucked up the courage to point it out. The knight's reaction was predictable. A deep frown, a string of curses directed at the general incompetence of the universe, and by extension, his squire, and an order to deal with it. Dealing with it in the middle of a muddy track, surrounded by equally exhausted and impatient men, with no veterinary supplies to speak of, was a challenge of epic proportions. Finn knelt in the muck, his already protesting knee screaming, and gently ran his hand down Thunderclap's leg. The horse, to its credit, merely grumbled and flicked an ear, a sign of grudging cooperation. Finn could feel a slight swelling just above the fetlock. Probably a stone bruise, or perhaps a minor sprain from the uneven ground. Nothing crippling, but enough to make the horse lame, and Sir Caelan even more insufferable. There was, of course, nothing he could do immediately beyond trying to clear any lodged debris and muttering soothing, if entirely insincere, words to the beast. The solution, as dictated by the knight after a brief, ill-tempered consultation with the sergeant, was for Sir Caelan to dismount and walk for a while. A suggestion met with a look of such profound offense from the knight that Finn almost felt sorry for the sergeant, and for Finn to take on the additional burden of carrying Sir Caelan's lance and shield, as well as his own load. Because naturally, when things went wrong, the solution always involved Finn carrying more things. There was no energy left to argue, no spirit left to protest. Just a weary sigh, a shifting of burdens, and the quiet addition of another layer to his already monumental resentment. Amidst this tapestry of toil and tribulation, there were fleeting, almost imperceptible moments that broke the oppressive monotony, nonverbal affirmations of shared existence. Once, as he stumbled on a loose rock, nearly pitching face first into a puddle that even he found uninviting, a calloused hand from the man-at-arms marching beside him shot out, steadying his arm. No word was exchanged, just a grunt from the man and a grateful, if exhausted, nod from Finn. It was a tiny gesture, a spark of disinterested assistance in the overwhelming darkness, a reminder that they were all, at least, suffering together. Later, after successfully restrapping a loose piece of baggage onto a pack mule that seemed determined to shed its load like autumn leaves, Finn caught the eye of the mule driver, a wizened old man with eyes that had seen too many miserable journeys. The man gave a curt, almost invisible dip of his chin, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even approval, for a small job done passably well in a world where most jobs were done badly, or not at all. Finn felt a brief private flicker of something akin to accomplishment, a tiny ember of pride in the vast cold fireplace of his fatigue. It was, of course, quickly extinguished by the next squelch of his boot in the mud and the realization that there were still countless miles to go. Time, in the afternoon, became a malevolent entity, a trickster god delighting in Finn's suffering. Some stretches, particularly when engaged in a task of profound, repetitive boredom, like recoiling a wet rope that seemed to have more knots than a lineage of inbred nobles, crawled by with agonizing slowness. Each minute felt like an hour, each hour an eternity. He would glance at the sky, willing the sun, or rather the slightly less dark patch of gray that masqueraded as the sun, to move, to dip towards the horizon. But it hung there, stubbornly, as if it too were mired in the endless mud. Then, perversely, when a particularly unpleasant task loomed, like the prospect of having to retrieve Sir Kaelin's dropped glove from a patch of suspiciously thorny bushes, time would suddenly accelerate, hurtling him towards the dreaded moment with cruel efficiency. The destination, the mythical border fort they were supposedly marching towards, remained stubbornly elusive, an abstract concept rather than a tangible place. Was the horizon actively retreating from them? Were they, perhaps, walking in enormous, pointless circles? The narrator might muse that time is subjective, and for those engaged in unending miserable labor, it develops a particularly cruel elasticity, stretching the moments of pain and compressing the moments of hypothetical relief. Finn, however, had no energy for such philosophical musings. He just wanted the day to end, for the mud to stop sucking at his boots, and for a brief, blessed moment where nothing and no one demanded anything of him. It was a modest wish, but in his current reality, it felt as extravagant as asking for a bath and a warm bed. As the sky began its slow, reluctant bleed from gray to a bruised purple, a collective sigh, almost too faint to be heard above the squelch of boots and the groaning of cartwheels, passed through the weary column. Evening. The word itself whispered of an end to toil, of rest, however inadequate. But for Finn and the other dregs of this mobile feudal enterprise, the fading light merely heralded a new chapter of difficulties, a fresh set of anxieties, and the dawning dreadful realization that the end of the day was a flexible concept, particularly when viewed from the perspective of those in charge. The diminishing light played cruel tricks. Roots and rocks, already treacherous, now became near invisible snares, lying in wait to trip the unwary or twist an already protesting ankle. Tasks that were merely difficult in daylight transformed into exercises in frustration and potential injury. Trying to secure a loose buckle on a pack strap with fingers numb from cold and eyes straining in the gloom was a special kind of purgatory. The sergeant, his voice now raspy with the day's exertions, urged everyone to make haste, to reach the pre-designated spot for their miserable night's encampment before true darkness descended. This urgency, of course, led to more mistakes, more fumbling, more dropped items that then had to be located by touch in the rapidly thickening shadows. The narrator might observe that the efficiency of trying to perform intricate tasks, like retying a knot that held a cooking pot precariously onto a mule, by the flickering, unreliable light of a single, sputtering torch carried by a man who was also trying not to fall into a ditch, was questionable at best. It was a masterclass in how to turn a simple job into a lengthy, potentially hazardous ordeal. This evening push, as it always was, proved to be the most dangerous part of the day. Exhaustion had reached saturation point. Every man was running on fumes, their bodies aching, their minds dull, their tempers worn tissue thin. This was when accidents, often of a bizarre and darkly comedic nature, tended to happen. And tonight, the universe, in its infinite capacity for slapstick cruelty, did not disappoint. It involved a man named Will, a lanky archer known for his perpetual sniffle and an uncanny ability to look surprised by even the most predictable events. Will was attempting to unhitch a particularly stubborn mule from a small supply sledge. The mule, embodying the general sentiment of the entire company, was having none of it. It stood stock still, ears flattened, a picture of passive resistance. Will, muttering a stream of increasingly creative insults that questioned the mule's parentage and future prospects, yanked harder on the rope. What happened next was a beautiful confluence of exhaustion, poor footing, and animal obstinacy. The rope, old and frayed, like everything else in their possession, suddenly snapped. Will, who had been putting his entire, albeit meager weight into the pull, was catapulted backwards with surprising velocity. His feet, seeking purchase on the slick mud, found only treachery. He executed a perfect, unintentional backflip, his arms flailing, his expression one of utter astonishment, before landing with a spectacular splash, backside first, into a particularly deep and pungent puddle of what could only be described as indeterminate origin. The mule, meanwhile, freed from its tether, took precisely 3 steps forward and began to calmly graze on a clump of damp weeds, as if this entire performance had been staged for its personal amusement. There was a stunned silence, broken only by the sound of Will sputtering and the mule's contented munching. Then a few of the men, despite their bone weariness, let out short, sharp barks of laughter. It wasn't malicious. It was the laughter of men pushed beyond caring, a release of tension, an acknowledgement of the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of their existence. Even the sergeant cracked a smile that looked more like a grimace. Will, covered head to toe in filth and wounded pride, merely sat in the puddle for a long moment, looking like a man who was seriously contemplating just staying there. The narrator might dryly note that it was moments like these that truly fostered camaraderie. Nothing binds men together quite like witnessing a colleague's utter humiliation. Tempers, already frayed, became even shorter. Muttered threats about what various individuals would like to do to the quartermaster for the state of the ropes, the weather for existing, and their own aching feet for also existing, became more frequent, though rarely loud enough to invite official censure. Just as a sliver of hope began to dawn in Finn's weary mind, the hope that they might actually stop, make camp, and achieve a state of misery that was at least stationary, the dreadful news filtered down the line. They weren't stopping yet. The Baron, their illustrious and largely incompetent leader, had decided they needed to push on for another hour, perhaps 2, to reach a slightly more defensible, read marginally less muddy, position he vaguely remembered from a map he'd glanced at 3 days ago. A collective groan, this one audible and heartfelt, rippled through the ranks. The crushing disappointment was a physical blow. Another hour, in the dark, through this terrain. It was a special kind of sadism. Finn felt his shoulders slump. The prospect of extended labor, of night work, loomed. He pictured the mosquitoes, who would undoubtedly be delighted by this decision, feasting upon their stationary, exhausted bodies as they tried to set up camp in the pitch black. At least the narrator might console him. He wouldn't be alone in his suffering. He'd have several hundred bloodthirsty insects for company, each one a tiny buzzing testament to the Baron's strategic genius. Eventually, mercifully, the order to halt for the night was given. They hadn't reached the Baron's mythical, defensible position. Instead, they stopped in a patch of slightly less sodden ground that offered the distinct advantage of being marginally further away from the river and its accompanying dampness. For Finn, the journey back to what would eventually become his sleeping quarters, once he'd helped erect Sir Kaelin's tent, unpacked the night's bedding, and tended to Thunderclap, was a fresh torment. If they were moving as a group, the journey back was merely the short, agonizing stumble from his final task of the day, to the patch of earth he would call his bed. Every step was a percussive symphony of aching joints and strained muscles. His feet, now feeling like two separate, very tender entities, protested each contact with the ground. The anticipation of rest, of simply being horizontal, battled with the certain knowledge that this rest would be inadequate, punctuated by the snores of Gregor, the coughing of Pip, the scuttling of unseen vermin, and the ever-present throb of his own abused body. It was less a journey to rest, and more a reluctant crawl towards a temporary cessation of the worst of the suffering. The atmosphere among the workers, as they began the slow, painful process of making camp, was one of profound, shared exhaustion, highlighted with the usual biting wit by the narrator. Communication was minimal, consisting mostly of grunts, weary gestures, and the occasional resigned curse as someone stumbled or dropped something vital. Any plans for the morrow were hollow murmurs of intent, discussions of if we even survive the night, or who gets to pretend to be too sick to carry the Baron's chamber pot, quickly dismissed by the overwhelming fatigue or the more pressing need to find out who had stolen their slightly less moldy piece of bread. There was a kind of camaraderie, though. It wasn't born of cheerful banter or shared jokes, but of shared silence, of synchronized weary movements as men erected makeshift shelters with the last vestiges of their strength. It was in the unspoken understanding that passed between two men struggling to lift a heavy provision box, a grim nod acknowledging their mutual burden. It was in the way they huddled around the sputtering, smoky fires, seeking warmth not just for their bodies but for their spirits, a collective affirmation that they had, against all odds, survived another day. The narrator might explain that these connections, these fleeting, unspoken bonds forged in the crucible of shared misery, were perhaps all that remained to affirm their humanity in a world that seemed determined to grind it out of them, one muddy, exhausting step at a time. The evening meal, if one were to dignify the congealed slop served in near darkness with such a term, was less a culinary experience and more a grim refueling exercise, a final insult to a day already overflowing with them. By the flickering, unreliable light of a few grudgingly maintained fires, Finn received his ration, a lumpy porridge of indeterminate grains, boiled with questionable water, and if he wasn't mistaken, a few stray bits of what might have been yesterday's leftover turnip, or perhaps just unusually pale mud. It was served in a wooden bowl that smelled faintly of every meal it had ever held, a kind of olfactory ghost of miseries past. The spoon, a splintered wooden affair, felt rough against his lips. Eating was a struggle. His jaw ached from a day spent clenching his teeth against the cold and the general unfairness of existence. He was so tired he could barely summon the energy to chew, each mouthful a monumental effort. The porridge itself seemed to fight back, a glutinous, lukewarm mass that coated his tongue with a taste he could only describe as damp regret. Around him, the social dynamics of feeding time played out with their usual grim predictability. Men hunched over their bowls, wolfing down the meager fare with the desperation of starving animals. Hoarding was common. A man might surreptitiously tuck a piece of his bread ration, if they were lucky enough to get bread, into a pouch for later, though later often meant discovering it had been pilfered by a hungrier, or simply less scrupulous, compatriot. Sharing was rare. An act of such profound altruism, it was often viewed with suspicion. What did they want in return? Stealing, however, was practically an art form, ranging from the blatant snatch and grab to more subtle sleight-of-hand maneuvers performed in the confusing firelight. Finn guarded his own bowl with a weary vigilance. His body curved around it, a posture that did his aching back no favors. The narrator, were he a food critic for a particularly bleak medieval chronicle, might describe the meal as an ambitious attempt to capture the essence of despair in a single bowl. Texturally challenging, aromatically aggressive, with a lingering finish of existential dread. 1 star. Would not recommend to a friend unless that friend had grievously wronged me. Once the ordeal of eating was concluded, the equally futile ritual of bodily maintenance began. Finn, like the others, made a cursory attempt to address the day's accumulated damage. He splashed some frigid, murky water from a communal bucket onto his face and hands, an act that did little to remove the ingrained grime, but succeeded admirably in making him feel even colder. Wounds. And there were always wounds, from blisters on his feet that had rubbed raw, to the scrape on his arm from a thorny bush he'd blundered into, to the ever-present nicks and calluses on his hands, were tended to with a prayer and perhaps a smear of grease if any was available. It was less about healing and more about preventing immediate putrescence. His clothes, still damp from the day's relentless drizzle and his unfortunate encounter with the gully, clung to him like a shroud. There was no hope of them drying before morning. Tomorrow's problems were already making themselves known. The blister on his heel throbbed with a fresh intensity, promising agony with the dawn. A new stiffness was settling into his neck from carrying Sir Kaelin's shield at an awkward angle. Nothing truly got clean. Everything hurt. The best one could hope for was a slight reduction in the overall level of filth and discomfort, a postponement of the inevitable infections and agues. The evening's social atmosphere, such as it was, unfolded in the cramped, smoky spaces around the dying fires. It was less social and more a collective, competitive audition for who could produce the most theatrical cough or the most heartfelt groan of suffering. Pip, the young archer, had settled into a rhythm of hacking fits that punctuated the night with alarming regularity, each one sounding like he was trying to dislodge a small, furry animal from his chest. Gregor, Finn's tent-mate-to-be, was already emitting a series of pre-slumber rumbles that suggested his snoring would soon achieve its usual epic proportions. Occasionally, a harsh laugh would cut through the gloom, usually following a particularly bleak joke about their chances of survival, or a recounting of some spectacular failure from the day, Will's impromptu mud bath being a current favorite. Gallows humor, the narrator might explain, was the opiate of the medieval foot soldier. The air was thick with unspoken anxieties about the sick and injured. Would they make it through the night? About the dwindling supplies. Would there be even less food tomorrow? About the ever-present threat of ambush. Were those noises in the dark just the wind, or something more sinister? Simmering resentments, too, hung heavy in the smoky air. Resentments against overbearing sergeants, incompetent nobles, and a god who seemed to have a particular fondness for making it rain on their parade. These shared miseries, these collective grunts and groans in the darkness, were what passed for connection. These were the sounds that affirmed, in their own wretched way, that they were not entirely alone, that their suffering, at least, was communal. Pre-sleep rituals were a study in creative pessimism. Finn, having fulfilled his final duties to Sir Kaelin, ensuring the knight's tent was as secure as possible against the wind and rain, and the thunderclap was as comfortable as a perpetually disgruntled warhorse could be in a muddy field, finally had a few moments to himself. He retreated to the dubious shelter he shared with Gregor and Pip. Comfort was a distant dream, but he made a few futile attempts. He rearranged the pitiful handful of damp straw that served as his mattress, trying to find a configuration that didn't involve a lump directly under his hip bone. He checked his boots for spiders or other unwelcome guests, a nightly ritual that rarely yielded results, but was performed out of a sense of grim duty. The vermin, he suspected, were probably more comfortable than he was anyway. At least they didn't have to get up at dawn. He positioned his dagger and belt close at hand, a habit born more of ingrained caution than any real expectation of needing them against anything other than an overly ambitious rat. He wrapped his thin, damp blanket around himself, a gesture that offered more psychological than actual warmth. His pre-sleep thoughts were a familiar litany, a fervent, silent prayer that it wouldn't rain inside the lean-to tonight, a grim calculation of how many hours of potential oblivion he might achieve before the first cough or snore shattered it, and a profound sense of weariness that went all the way to his soul. And then, the cruelest irony of all, to be utterly bone-crushingly exhausted, yet unable to find the release of sleep. His body throbbed with 100 different aches, each one vying for his attention. The cut on his hand stung. His back screamed a silent protest with every tiny shift in position, and the damp cold seemed to have burrowed deep into his marrow. His mind, far from shutting down, replayed the day's miseries with infuriating clarity. The fall into the gully, the snapping girth strap, the sheer, unrelenting slog through the mud. Anxiety about tomorrow gnawed at him. Would the rain ever stop? Would Thunderclap's leg be worse? Would Sir Kalen devise some new, inventive torment? The night was filled with the sounds of suffering, Pip's coughing, Gregor's snores escalating into a full-blown nasal earthquake, the rustle of unseen things in the darkness, the distant, mournful howl of a wolf that sounded far too close for comfort. Each noise was a fresh jolt, pulling him back from the precipice of unconsciousness. He lay there staring into the oppressive blackness, feeling the profound, grinding unfairness of it all. Eventually, perhaps hours later, a fitful, shallow sleep might claim him, a sleep filled with disjointed, anxious dreams of endless marching, of falling, of Sir Kalen's disapproving frown. Or perhaps he would simply lie there until the first miserable hint of gray dawn, resigned to another sleepless night, a silent, weary sentry guarding nothing but his own exhaustion. The narrator might close the section with a suitably bleak but witty thought, that for Finn, sleep wasn't a refuge, merely a brief, often interrupted pause in a life sentence of hard labor, and the rats, at least, probably slept soundly. Young Finn, our unfortunate lens into the daily grind of medieval squirehood, was but one flickering soul in a vast, sprawling constellation of suffering. It's a comforting fiction we tell ourselves that history is forged by the grand pronouncements of kings and the glorious deeds of shining knights. But the truth, as always, is far muddier, far more mundane, and infinitely more miserable for the vast majority of people involved. For every Sir Kalen, preening in his polished armor, polished by someone else naturally, there were scores, hundreds, thousands of Finns, squires, pages, men-at-arms, carters, cooks, laundresses, and a veritable army of other unglamorous toilers whose names never made it into the illuminated manuscripts. Estimating exact numbers is a historian's parlor game, prone to frustrating imprecision, but it's safe to say that the infrastructure of chivalry, the entire creaking, clanking, and frequently incompetent edifice of medieval warfare and nobility, was built upon a bedrock of their collective misery. Millions, across centuries and continents, lived lives not dissimilar to Finn's. A daily ration of backbreaking labor, inadequate food, appalling sanitation, and the constant looming threat of violence or disease, all endured with little hope of advancement or even basic comfort. The narrator can only marvel with a certain detached admiration at humanity's apparently inexhaustible capacity for organizing itself in such a way as to ensure that a very large number of people have a truly terrible time, for the supposed benefit of a very small number of people. It's a talent we've honed to a remarkably sharp edge throughout the ages. And why was this role, the role of the squire, so crucial, despite its inherent awfulness? Why did young men like Finn subject themselves to years of this thankless servitude? Well, for some, it was the theoretical path to knighthood itself. A chance to trade the ragtag misery of a squire for the slightly better fed, marginally more respected, but often equally perilous misery of a knight. For many, like Finn, choice was a luxury they couldn't afford. It was service born of obligation, debt, or simply the lack of any less terrible alternatives in a world rigidly structured by birth and fealty. But their suffering, their endless toil, was the grease that kept the gears of the feudal war machine turning. A knight, particularly one as self-involved as Sir Kalen, was a high-maintenance piece of military hardware. He couldn't buckle his own armor, sharpen his own sword effectively, or even, it often seemed, locate his own backside with both hands and a map, without the assistance of his squire. Finn and his brethren were the logistics, the support staff, the roadies for the medieval equivalent of a very violent, very poorly organized rock band. Their pain enabled the pageantry. Their sweat polished the veneer of chivalry. The grand tournaments, the noble quests, the very concept of a mounted, armored warrior as the pinnacle of martial prowess, all of it was utterly dependent on a vast, unacknowledged network of overworked, underappreciated young men learning the trade from the ground up, starting with muck and progressing, if they were lucky, to slightly less offensive muck. The irony, of course, is that the grand historical narratives, the sweeping tales of heroism and conquest, rarely spare a thought for the calloused hands that made it all possible. It's like praising a magnificent castle without acknowledging the thousands of forgotten souls who quarried the stone, hauled it, and died building the damn thing. The ironies embedded in a squire's life were as plentiful and as biting as the fleas in his bedding. Consider the central aspiration for many: knighthood. They toiled in pursuit of a status that often just meant they'd be in the front line of the next pointless skirmish, with a higher chance of being captured and ransomed, a financial burden that would then fall upon their own impoverished estates, if they had any. They were apprentice heroes, learning the chivalric code, a code that preached honor, largesse, and courtesy, often from knights who were, in practice, brutish, self-serving, and about as courteous as a badger with a toothache. They maintained the symbols of this chivalry: the gleaming armor, which they spent hours scouring, only for it to be dented and bloodied anew; the sharp swords, which they painstakingly whet, knowing their own lives might depend on their master's ability to wield it, or, more likely, on their ability to drag their master out of trouble when he inevitably overextended himself. They transported and cared for luxuries they would never personally enjoy. The fine wine Sir Cailan sipped, while Finn choked down brackish water. The fur-lined cloak the knight wore while Finn shivered in threadbare wool. The very warhorse, Thunderclap. A magnificent beast that cost more than Finn would earn in a lifetime, yet whose daily droppings were his personal responsibility. They were the invisible foundation of a system that, by its very design, offered them precious little in return beyond the vague promise of glory, a commodity that, as Finn was rapidly discovering, filled no bellies and warmed no beds. And how were these indispensable individuals, these human cogs in the great feudal machine, treated by history? For the most part, they were utterly erased. The chronicles sing of kings and their councils, of dukes and their dazzling retinues, of knights and their often exaggerated battlefield prowess. We remember Richard the Lionheart, but not the name of the squire who almost certainly had to deal with the royal laundry on campaign. We hear of the valiant charge at Agincourt, but less about the thousands of exhausted, dysentery-ridden archers and men-at-arms who actually won the day, or the boys who had to retrieve the arrows afterwards. History, largely written by and for the literate elite, or those they employed, had a distinct bias. It preferred the epic sweep, the grand gesture, the heroic individual, preferably one with a title and a suitably impressive coat of arms. The daily, grinding reality of those who supported this elite, the sheer, unglamorous effort required to keep the whole precarious enterprise afloat, was deemed unworthy of record. It was perhaps too mundane, too uncomfortable a reminder that greatness often stands on a mountain of someone else's sweat and sacrifice. The narrator might sarcastically theorize that perhaps the chroniclers simply ran out of ink after detailing all the noble lineages and heroic speeches, or maybe they just assumed that the suffering of the common man was as unremarkable and as unchangeable as the weather, unpleasant certainly, but hardly worth writing home about. Yet the echoes of Finn's world, the patterns of his particular brand of structured misery, haven't entirely vanished. One doesn't need to squint too hard to see the continuity, the subtle, witty parallels to our own, supposedly more enlightened times. The unpaid intern fetching coffee and enduring passive-aggressive critiques in a gleaming corporate office isn't facing the same physical perils as Finn, but the power dynamics, the thankless tasks performed in the vague hope of future advancement, the quiet endurance of minor humiliations. Is it entirely different? The gig economy worker, juggling multiple apps, uncertain of their next paycheck, rushing to meet algorithmically determined deadlines, isn't mucking out a medieval latrine, but the precariousness, the feeling of being a disposable component in a system far larger and more indifferent than oneself, might resonate. The call center employee, absorbing the frustrations of unseen customers while sticking to a soul-crushing script, isn't polishing armor, but the repetitive strain, the emotional labor, the sense of being a faceless voice in a vast machine, has a certain familiar ring. This isn't to preach, or to draw false equivalencies about the sheer, brutal physicality of Finn's existence. It's merely to observe, with that characteristic weary wanderer dry wit, that the fundamental human comedy and tragedy of someone, somewhere, having a really, really bad day, or a bad year, or a bad lifetime, so that someone else can have a slightly better, or at least more comfortable one, continues in myriad forms. Progress is a wonderful thing, but it seems to have a remarkable talent for finding new and inventive ways to distribute the unpleasantness. Finn, a boy covered in mud and existential angst, was just an earlier, less well-documented iteration of a very old story. So what became of our Finn, our long-suffering, mud-encrusted squire? History, alas, rarely bothers to record the final chapters of such unremarkable lives. There are no statues of Finn, no ballads sung of his heroic latrine duty, or his stoic endurance of Sir Caelan's monologues. For young men like him, the path rarely led to a peaceful retirement with a fat pension and a cottage by the sea. Statistically speaking, Finn's prospects were grim, delivered with the kind of factual detachment that makes the horror all the more piquant. Life expectancy for someone in his station, exposed daily to hardship, disease, and the casual violence of the era, was brutally short. If a stray arrow in some forgotten skirmish over a disputed pigsty didn't claim him, then infection from a minor wound certainly might. Or perhaps a particularly vicious bout of dysentery, the bloody flux as it was so charmingly known, would carry him off, a deeply undignified end even by medieval standards. Pneumonia from one too many nights spent sleeping in damp clothes on cold ground was a strong contender. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd survive long enough to actually become a knight, at which point his chances of dying violently in battle would increase exponentially. The odds of him escaping this life, of finding some quiet, comfortable niche elsewhere, were so vanishingly small as to be statistically negligible. Approximately zero, give or take a miracle. And miracles, in Finn's experience, were usually reserved for saints or very wealthy nobles who could afford to bribe the appropriate celestial authorities. His legacy, then, is not writ in stone, nor sung by minstrels. You won't find his name in the rolls of honor, unless it's by mistake, perhaps as a smudge next to Sir Caelan's slightly more legible signature. But Finn, and the countless others like him, did leave a legacy, albeit an anonymous and often unlovely one. It's there in the faint traces of old roads, routes that were once muddy tracks like the one he so miserably trod, slowly paved over by centuries but still following the paths worn by generations of weary feet. It's there in the foundations of crumbling castles, stones hauled and set by men whose names are lost, but whose labor endures. It's even there, perhaps, in some of the military techniques and traditions, the rudimentary logistics and support systems that evolved, painfully slowly, from the organized chaos of medieval campaigns. Though one hopes, with slightly more emphasis on sanitation and a better quality of rope. And, of course, his most enduring legacy, shared with millions, is in the very systems of exploitation that, while they may have changed their outward form, still demonstrate a remarkable continuity in ensuring that someone, somewhere, is having a thoroughly rotten time for the convenience of others. Ah, some things, the narrator might sigh, truly are timeless. Yet, despite the filth, the pain, the sheer unending soul-crushing awfulness of his existence, it's crucial to remember that Finn was human. This isn't an attempt to romanticize his suffering, to paint it with a veneer of noble endurance. His life was, by most objective standards, dreadful. But within that dreadful framework, he was a person. He probably loved something or someone, however briefly or foolishly. Perhaps a stray dog that showed him a moment's affection, or the memory of his mother's thin stew, which, compared to Cuthbert's culinary abominations, might have seemed like a feast. He undoubtedly hoped, even if those hopes were as battered and frayed as his tunic. Hope for a warmer day, for a meal that didn't taste of despair, for a moment's peace, for Sir Calin to perhaps just once find his own damn gloves. He would have found fleeting moments of meaning, or at least distraction, in the smallest of things. The way a beetle diligently rolled its ball of dung, a kindred spirit perhaps, in its dedication to a thankless task. A brief patch of unexpected sunshine, the rare occasion when Thunderclap didn't try to bite him. These weren't grand, heroic sentiments, but the small, flickering embers of humanity that even the most oppressive conditions can struggle to entirely extinguish. He was not a caricature of misery. He was a young man, dealt a very bad hand by the lottery of birth, trying to navigate a brutal world with what little agency he possessed, probably with a good deal of quiet, cynical grumbling under his breath. So, the next time you find yourself complaining about your commute because the train is delayed by 5 minutes, or because your artisanal coffee isn't quite the right temperature, or because the Wi-Fi in your climate-controlled office is a bit sluggish, perhaps spare a thought for Finn. Remember him, ankle-deep in mud that smells faintly of regret and ancient pig, wrestling with a bad-tempered warhorse in the pre-dawn chill, his stomach rumbling with a hunger that today's stale bread ration will only mock, not satisfy. Remember his daily battle with sentient mud, his futile attempts at hygiene with questionable water, and his nights spent trying to achieve oblivion, while being serenaded by a chorus of snores and coughs. It might not make your own minor inconveniences disappear, but it might just lend them a touch of darkly humorous perspective. Appreciate your waterproof shoes, your readily available antibiotics, and your distinct lack of obligation to polish anyone else's armor. These are luxuries Finn could only have dreamt of, probably in between nightmares about being trampled by Thunderclap or having to carry the Baron's chamber pot for eternity. And so, we leave him there, a final image etched in the damp gray tapestry of the 13th century. See him, Finn, 19 years old and already ancient with weariness, trudging onward. His shoulders are stooped under the weight of his burdens, both literal and existential. His face is smudged with dirt. His clothes are a testament to every puddle and misfortune he's encountered. He's exhausted but enduring, not out of any grand heroism, but because the alternative is simply to stop and be swallowed by the mud, and that seems like too much effort. He's broken in a dozen subtle ways, his spirit bruised, his body aching, but not entirely beaten, mostly because being thoroughly beaten would require a level of focused attention from his oppressors that they rarely bothered to expend on someone so insignificant. He is forgotten by the grand narratives, a footnote to a footnote in the annals of history, yet utterly essential to the functioning of his world. He is the weary wanderer personified, a testament to the incredible, often absurd resilience of the human spirit in the face of relentless, grinding misery. And as he plods on, one aching foot in front of the other, towards a destination that promises little more than another day just like this one, perhaps he permits himself a small, grim smile at the sheer, unadulterated ridiculousness of it all. Or maybe that's just a trick of the fading, unreliable light.